to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your boy, your favorite conservatarian, Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. And I've got another amazing conversation for you guys. We're going to talk about something a little bit different. It's still kind of in the same wheelhouse as the stuff that I talk about, but maybe a little bit different. But I think you're really going to enjoy it. I'm very excited about my guest. But before I get into everything, you know what to do. You got to like this video. You got to share this video. You got to subscribe. If you haven't already subscribed, I don't know how you're even getting through life. Hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. That way you'll be reminded anytime I upload a new interview, which I do every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard. Also, if you want to support my work monetarily, you've got all the links in the show notes below. I appreciate any and everything. It helps me to bring you this wonderful content. And without further ado, I'm just going to bring on my guest right now. I have with me the founder of Celebrate Kids, associate founder of Ignite the Family. She's also on the faculty at Summit Ministries, Dr. Kathy Koch. Welcome to the program.
I'm so glad to be here, Jeff. Thank you for trusting me with your important audience.
Good. I appreciate it. I mean, I've read through all your bona fides, so I can't think of anybody else who I would trust more with the subject. And it's something I talk about a lot, but we're going to talk a little bit about education, about culturally responsive teaching, because I mean that's kind of coming down the pike of people are talking about it. But before we get into all that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Dr. Koch?
I would love to. I come from a wonderful family. I was raised in church and was raised to believe that education matters. So both my brother and myself have earned PhDs. My brother actually has a postdoctorate, which was 2 years after a PhD. We were raised to be curious and thoughtful and to contribute to society and to the culture. And so it's a real honor to be able to do that. I'm a former teacher, coach, school board member, and professor. And I did each of those thinking I would do it forever, but was then called into this opportunity in a ministry where I do a lot of parent education. We speak a lot at homeschool events. We do a lot of church-based parent education because parents want to get it right. They want to understand, how to parent during this dangerous, confusing cultural time, if I can say it that way. We do a lot of work with kids directly as well. Like Summit is the 16 to 25-year-old biblical worldview. Love embracing them here in Manitou Springs, Colorado, and author of 6 books with Moody Publishers. I just want to be influential. And Jeff, I take it that that's something that you strive for as well, that take information, but we don't want to go to the grave with it. We want to be influential with it. And it's a humbling experience that anybody would listen to me. And it's a delight as well to share truth. So I'm happy to be here.
Good. I'm glad. So can you give us an idea of what made you transition over into educating parents and getting more involved in that space? Like, what sparked that for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. And you and your listeners might be interested to know that I'm actually not a parent myself. I'm not married. I'm single and very content. I have a great family. Singles are not alone or lonely or unloved or unlovable. I just happen to be unmarried. My brother married my best friend. They have 3 kids who adore me, and that's really special. But I was a professor. I was teaching people how to teach children how to read. And certainly being a school teacher is significant. Being a professor to help them do it better was significant. But as a Christ follower and a reader of the Holy Word of God, I could not get past Deuteronomy 6 and other passages that proclaim that parents will always be a child's first and foremost, most important teacher. And, if you're a parent, you're told how to give birth, diaper, feed, and bathe. And they send you home with this person that you're in charge of. And I was given some feedback that a lot of the things that I was teaching my university students, parents would benefit from so that they could parent well and parent long and strong. And so I kind of experimented a little bit with some parent audiences, got some great feedback. And then, Jeff, I met the right people. I think we always need to be alert to the relationships, even the fact that you and I are meeting today. I don't believe it's an accident or a coincidence that we would be meeting. And it might be for more than just this one opportunity to share truth with your listeners. So being raised to believe that, my grandfather was mayor of my city. So I was raised to always have an other-centered perspective of life. So I was looking for people who could mentor me and help me develop into who I thought I was supposed to be. And lo and behold, 31 years ago, I moved from Green Bay, Wisconsin to Fort Worth, Texas to do this. And I think this is it. I kind of joke with God, like, this is it, right? Because I thought I would teach second graders forever, and I lasted 4 years. But, parents matter greatly, and teachers matter still. Church-based and school-based teachers still matter greatly to all of us at the ministry. But we really want to help parents parent the children they were given, not the children they wish they had. And we want them to do it well.
I like that, the children they wish they had. And I can relate to what you're talking about with, is this it, God, or is this it? Because, what they say, people plan and God laughs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, given that you're working with parents, what... I'm trying to think of how to ask this question. With what we're seeing going on in schools right now, what are some of the biggest concerns that parents are bringing to you right now, especially let's just say over the past 3 to 5 years? What are the biggest concerns that they're bringing to you? What are they worried about the most?
Well, it won't surprise anyone if I say first, it would be the gay and lesbian agenda that far too many public schools have bought into. And so a persuasive, argumentative debate attitude toward it. I think all of us have always known there are people different from us, and we try to give people grace and space. And yet, over the last couple of years, I'm hearing from more public school parents all over America that they don't feel safe anymore, that their opinions are the opinions of their children, in particular with gender, are just being dismissed, and it becomes a really scary thing. When I was a teacher of second graders, my students knew that I enjoyed racquetball and played with my principal. They knew that I was musical and athletic, and I told them some things about myself. But the person of the teacher was not as relevant as people have made it out to be today, where there are people who on the first day of school will proclaim their status and their pronoun. And I just think, the teacher teaches, books don't, teachers teach. And so it is important that we know who the person in front of the children is, because that person's value system is going to be passed on. And that's something that I hear a lot about. Certainly even the reframing of America that I gather you're concerned about as well, Jeff, and I would say boldly, if you take down a statue, that doesn't change history. If you change the name of a school, because all of a sudden, we're aware of some negatives associated with that person. Can we go back and look at why the person was honored in the first place to have a school named after them? There must have been something good that was going on. Again, changing the system doesn't rewrite history, but the rewriting of history, if you look at history curriculum, there are entire sections now that are ignored. There is a rewriting of the history, which of course is very, very dangerous. You know what, my friend, if we decided 2 + 2 was 5, we would be laughed out of the room. But it's not happening with history. But I personally believe that the fact of history, many of the facts of history are the same as a fact of 2 + 2 is always 4. I'm sure there are always interpretations of certain things, but those things come to mind. And then I'll say one other thing before I kick it back to you, Jeff, and that would be this. During the COVID crisis, when many of our private and public schools were closed and they did home education, which is not homeschooling. Educating at home, being run by a system, is not the same as home educating your children, which I'm a fan of. So these parents had a lot of Zoom rooms, and they would observe their 7-year-old and their 14-year-old in a Zoom room with the other kids with the teacher. And these teachers, the parents, found out that their kids didn't know as much as they thought they knew. And they found out that their 4th grader was doing second grade level math, which they weren't aware of because either it wasn't sent home under that understanding, or the parent hadn't needed to be as invested and involved. And now through the COVID crisis, one good thing that came of it, in my opinion, is parental awareness of what's going on. And so those would be things. One more thing, Jeff, if you don't mind, I want to say clearly, there are excellent people in our public schools. There are excellent administrators, school board members, and teachers who are trying to stay the course. There are excellent parents who mean well by being in that system, whether it be a private or a public school, trying to do the job. And yet it's very difficult because the system is broken. Teachers don't have the kind of authority. When I taught second graders and when I was a university professor, I had a lot of authority. I was considered the expert for my discipline and had rights to make decisions. And now there are many teachers who were hired for their expertise, but are then ignored because school administrators are making decisions so that the whole school is on the same page. And that, frankly, dismisses the educator, which is one of the reasons that they're quitting their jobs in droves.
Now that's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, I guess when I was younger, it felt like my teachers had a lot more latitude with what they taught. I mean, I'm sure there were guidelines, but I mean, still, like
Yes.
I didn't realize that things had gotten so uniform. But there was something else that you said that stood out to me, because during the COVID-19 pandemic, when kids were attending school from home, that's when a lot of parents found out about a lot of this critical race theory stuff and the gender stuff. But it was interesting that you brought up that they were also finding out that their kids were essentially getting a lower level or substandard level of education.
Yes.
So do you think
I personally believe, Jeff, that as damaging as critical race theory and gender theory and the rewriting of history and some of these things are, I think it's abusive. I think it's insanity, and I think it's dangerous for our present and our future. You ignore the past, it will repeat itself, and it's not looking good for us. The way that the first responders and our protective sources are being treated, all of that is wrong, and that would be enough of a reason for some people to abandon the system. But for even liberal people who don't think there's anything wrong with critical race theory, we're very disturbed to find out that their children were not academically doing well. And then they've chosen to either pull them for a different system or hire a tutor or go into the school board and demand a different level of teaching.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow. That's a lot there. That's a lot.
Yeah,
there.
You asked.
And I do want to get into homeschooling in a little bit, but I also wanted to talk about culturally responsive learning. I mean, look, we've been hearing about critical race theory. Then we started hearing about the whole gender identity issue, which when that first came out, I was like, this is going to get even bigger than critical race theory. This is going to be even more of a problem. But from what I'm hearing, and I want to see if you can shed some light on this, culturally responsive learning is kind of being used as a vehicle to still infuse the critical race theory ideas without calling it critical race theory because of the laws that have been passed and the backlash and all of that. What can you tell us about that?
That is insightful, Jeff. The fact that you've seen that, congratulations, because you're right that people have such a strong allegiance to the liberal ideology that they're going to find a way. They're going to find a way to get it in. So that's a really good point. Yeah, culturally responsive teaching, it's always been there. As a teacher of my students, I wanted to be culturally sensitive. I taught in rural Indiana. So if I was teaching a history unit about the big city, I knew that the students had very little experience with that. I remember distinctly teaching a unit about the post office, and we learned to address our envelopes and the return address and how to write a letter, dear grandma. Well, in the district where I taught school, the children's letters were delivered by an employee who drove her personal car. So it was a personal car that would stop at the driveway of the farms and drop off the letters and the bills. But in the curriculum that I was teaching, that wasn't mentioned. What was mentioned was, of course, the rectangular post office truck that was, right? And so I had to adapt the curriculum so that my students wouldn't feel ignored or less than. I didn't throw away what I was given. I just added to it. So we've always, I would pray, good teachers have always wanted to be culturally sensitive so that their students wouldn't feel like we didn't know who they were. But now it's this idea that in fact, I read a doc, I was doing a little bit of research to prepare for our talk today. And there's an association that believes that you should never, I'm reading directly from their website, do not blame students for difficult behavior. Understand their culture. They might be from a difficult situation. Do not blame their students. Don't blame your students for difficult behavior. Well, I'm sorry. If there's a cultural responsiveness, let's say there's dysfunction in a family. I don't care what race they are. Maybe there's dysfunction. Maybe there's 6 parents, 12 grandparents. The kids are a little bit confused by authority. They have one standard in one home for technology use, a whole different standard in another home. And they come to school confused and messed up about what is right and what is wrong. And so they behave however they want because they're ignored at home, or they don't understand that there's a an absolute standard for right and wrong. I'm sorry, it is not my job as an educator to allow that child to live in that confusion in my school when I have 20 other students who are going to be watching how I react to this one student who is, sadly, because of a cultural dysfunction, if I could put it that way, not behaving well. I think that's ridiculous. Do I think that we can be responsive to understanding their background and making sure they don't feel left out? Of course I do. That's just common sense. We've been doing this forever. That's the other thing that's fascinating. There are people who are making it out like it's a new thing. We've been doing culturally responsive teaching forever, but you're right. It's come up in the literature now as something new because they have a new agenda.
Yeah, see, because there are a couple of teachers who I've talked to about this, and what they're telling me is that, when they were learning culturally responsive learning, it was something a lot different from what it is right now. So can you kind of walk us through what do we need to know about the differences between those two, like the difference between how it started and what it is right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. In my opinion, it started with, the common sense, appropriate. Who are your students? You don't teach the masses, you teach the individuals. As an example, when I was a professor in Green Bay, Wisconsin, I had many adult Native American students, and they had different perspectives about eye contact and different things. I needed to respect that, and I didn't assume that they would come up to what I thought was right. However, it was my job to prepare them to teach non-Native Americans who would have a different perspective about language and family dynamics and things like eye contact. So it was my responsibility to respect who they were and not demand that they become like me, be arrogant, but to help them see the differences between their culture and another culture so that they weren't put into a difficult situation where they would not be able to be successful. Nowadays, I think there are people who would say, no, Kathy, they have a right to be who they are, and everybody else needs to come toward them. So then I'm going to boldly say that who loses in that are the Caucasian white kids from a nuclear family with 2.5 kids and a dog. Does that make sense? We're the ones that are left out, quite frankly, if I can say that, because we don't have a right to be the norm anymore. And that's okay. I mean, we shouldn't be the norm or we're not the norm. But where we're the norm, let us be the norm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I can't even imagine what it would be like to even try to do that as a teacher. I mean, if your class is like a quarter Hispanic and a quarter Black and a quarter Asian and a quarter white, right, how do you account for all of those cultures? You can't. I mean, I don't see how you can do it and still be effective. And I would imagine that would also damage the quality of education that they're getting if we're just so caught up in these things. Like, I understand you got to make things relatable. Like, I just learned from you that mail people used to deliver mail in their personal cars. I grew up in the city, so I saw the truck. So I get that. I get the need to make things relatable. But it sounds like this is turning into something where it's more about how do I want to? It's less about the education and more about being. Politically correct isn't the word I want to use because this is beyond political correctness. I don't know. Maybe
I agree, sir. I agree.
Yeah, maybe like politically correct on steroids. I don't know. It just seems like a lot of what I'm hearing with culturally responsive teaching is that they're taking something that may be good and pushing it to an extreme that. And it sounds like they haven't really thought this stuff through, or maybe they have, and this is by design.
Well,
I don't really. This is what I don't really understand here.
They don't need to think it through if they think they're right. They're just going to bully us into agreeing until we follow the system. That's what I've seen happen in a lot of our public schools, and excuse me, actually the political realm as well. And so that is really damaging. And you're right, sir, about Hispanics and Asians and Blacks and whites, and then you throw in a few others. It isn't easy. And we're teaching children math. I believe in any culture, 2 + 2 = 4.
Sure.
And I believe in any culture, H2O stands for water. And I believe in any culture that if you don't follow scientific reasoning and you arrogantly decide to own a process and do it your way, you could blow up the chem lab. And would I excuse that? Because I would simply say, well, in their culture, they believe in independent thinking. Well, I'm going to boldly say that when you're at home, you can have all the independent thinking you want. But I'm in a
You
school
blow up
where
your own house.
yeah, I mean, in my ministry, my job to my students would be to teach them scientific reasoning so they can be a successful scientist one day, or go to a trade school, tech school, university, gap year, missionary experience and be a successful scientist. And so, there are some things that I don't believe should be as influenced by culture as people think they ought to be. And that's where we stand up and say that's ridiculous. Science is science. Now, where we become culturally sensitive would be if I'm a science teacher, I teach science. Excuse me. I teach children science. And let's say that I want them to spend a month, in addition to the laboratory and the other things that we're learning about science, I want them to choose a significant scientist from history to study so they can understand that anybody's background doesn't define their outcome, that they can become, right? So then it's my responsibility then to make sure that on my list of scientists that you can choose from are Asians, Blacks, Hispanics, whites, men, women, older and younger. That's culturally sensitive, and that's super appropriate. And you know what? I would be bold if I were teaching. You know what I would do, Jeff? I would have an Asian choose a non-Asian, so that they discover non-Asians are bright. I would make an African-American student choose a white scientist to study. That's bold of me to say that, but again, isn't our responsibility in school to prepare them for life?
Yes, exactly.
The purpose,
and it should
Jeff,
be like that should be normal.
Yeah, the purpose of school is to not get children ready for more school. As I understand it, the purpose of school is to get them ready for life.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, Jeff, in life, you're not always going to be able to do it your way.
That's true. Yeah, and you're not always going to be around one type of person. I mean, unless you want the government to bring back segregation. I don't know, but I mean, but so what I'm hearing, and I agree. I mean, there is room for the cultural, and then there's areas where there's not room for it. When it's science, when it's math, when it's objective truth, which if I said that in front of some of these people, they would melt down like the Wicked Witch of the West when Dorothy threw water on her. But I mean, this is common sense. I think anybody can figure this out. So what do you think their objective is here in pushing this stuff so hard?
Some of them have been legitimately hurt by a system that was broken and they were negated. And I respect that. Mm-hmm. There were days and ages, and it wasn't that long ago. And it depends upon the city, the rural, the communication, the superintendent of schools, the curriculum that's used. I mean, there's any number of things that factor into this, but there was a time and a day when there were some people who were negated, who were not considered bright, who were they did not have authority of decision making. All authority was taken away. I respect that, and I grieve that for them. So I think that there are some people who are making decisions today in light of what happened forever ago, and assuming that we who are now alive should be punished for what happened to them, when right. I'm sorry, I think that to blame my ancestors, blame me for what was normative back then is a bit of a stretch as well. So I think some of that is it's tragic, and I do ache for the loss that people have experienced. But I think they're going about it in the wrong way. They're trying to repair damage that it's in the past. The past is in the past. We can influence the present and the future even without considering the past. In my opinion, again, I don't want to be offensive here to anybody, but it's a mess.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the way I see it, and here's what I'm saying, Dr. Cook, and maybe you know it's the same thing. There was stuff that happened in the past. Some of it in the not too distant past, whether it was due to race discrimination, racism, or what have you, whatever the reason was for different types. There's all types of evil that has happened in this country and others. But what's happening now, it feels like an overcorrection. Mm-hmm. Like this stuff happened, and so to correct it, we're going to go way in the opposite direction And what happens is, I'm seeing it come full circle. I mean, segregation used to be enforced by the government, racial segregation. Now, in 2022, we have schools pushing affinity groups that are race-based, that discriminate on the basis of race.
Yeah.
And woke segregation is just as bad as Jim Crow segregation.
Man.
And so I'm thinking, like, instead of taking a more sensible approach, we just went all the way the opposite direction, and we haven't found that balance yet. Does that make sense, or am I off base?
Yes, sir. Jeff, I think that's very well worded, and I would support everything that you just said. And this, again, so people like us who are in the trenches can stand up. And this can be a brave teacher and a parent and a grandparent and a mayor of a city and a school board member and a city council member and a garbage man, woman, anybody that's there, and you're watching your children being enforced into this system that you believe is not going to be good for them. We need to stand up and against that. So they might mean well, but it doesn't mean that thought it through. And Jeff, there are a lot of people making decisions about education now that have no experience in education. I'm not opposed to a mayor and to a mom and a dad and a grandparent going to a school board meeting and speaking up. Absolutely. We have a right in America for that free speech, right. Praise God. However, I would say that the people who are making these decisions, like you're talking about these affinity groups, do they understand how it's affecting education from 8 to 3, 180 days a year? And do they understand what the kids are taking away from these experiences? And again, is that good and is that not good for them? Does it prepare them for their tomorrows?
Yeah, and it seems like it's not. I mean, what about the teachers? I'm sure you've spoken to teachers. I mean, would you say most of them are on board with the culturally responsive stuff, or are they just afraid to speak up, or are they just gung-ho about it? Like, what have you noticed?
That's great. I did a little bit of research among teacher friends in preparation for today's interview. And I thank you again for allowing me to be on your show. And people I've known for years who I trust with everything has said to me things like culturally responsive teaching has always been what we've been asked to do, but the objective has changed. It used to be neutral. It used to be for everyone, be culturally sensitive. And that would be as simple as, a child lost a dad and it's a week before Father's Day, or that would be a June example, Mother's Day in May. A week before Mother's Day, a child lost a grandmother or a mom, and you know that, well, you're culturally sensitive, and you don't call on that child to read a poem about moms. You maybe don't even make them make a gift for mom unless they want to make it for a grandmother or an aunt, Kathy, I'll take it, That's culturally sensitive to the individual, and then cultural to the Black, culture for the Asian, culture for, the bigger groups. They've kind of laughed at me and said, we've always done it. But here's the change. I think, and this is what I heard, and I'm going to just be very bold and trust you and your audience with this.
Sure.
You're familiar, Jeff, in again, my research, there's something called verbal overlap. In many African-American families and Hispanic families, the communication style is what's called verbal overlap. They talk on top of each other. I've observed this. You can watch, 3 to 5 African-Americans, right, have a conversation, and you're intuitive with each other. It's not, I don't think it's a prideful one-upmanship. I mean, maybe it is sometimes. But are you able, Jeff, to listen to 3 conversations at the same time and contribute valuable truth to all 3? I think many in your culture can. Many Hispanics can. I've watched it. It's verbal overlap. They start and they stop and they start and they stop and they step on each other, and it looks like they're interrupting. It looks like they're rude. They don't consider it rude. They consider it my culture. We've always done it this way. Now, they might not know it's called verbal overlap in the educational literature.
Nobody knows it's a term for it.
No, but that's what it is.
That's how we do it.
But and here's the thing, my friend. If I'm teaching a bunch of 4th graders or sophomores in high school, and a bunch of them happen to be of the verbal overlap culture, Hispanic and African American predominantly, and we're having a class discussion, will I allow that to take place? And what about the Asians and Caucasians and other kids who can't follow the conversation and the reasoning because it's too cluttered and it's too, I can't hear what Elizabeth just said and what did, Arika just say? Or do I expect them to respect each other? Is that considered bad for them? Or is that considered normative? And I would go back, Jeff, what are we preparing them for? We're preparing them for life. And there is a day coming, my friend, when they may not be employed by a man or a woman who is a verbal overlap person, but who believes that you honor each other and you trust and you respect and you're other-centered, and you wait for someone to finish their thought before you share yours. Is it wrong for us to expect that or train them for that? I don't want to negate their culture, but I want to lift them up. Not because I think their culture is less than, but because I want them to achieve in a system where that is typically not the norm. Now, if they're going to work in a family business or they're going to work in that, great, go for it. I would not want a job there. I would have a headache. So don't hire me. That's fine. Hire the verbal overlap people. But in school, when we have a requirement of, a 45-minute period with 28 kids, that's where I feel like some of what these organizations think is expected is not very realistic and potentially quite damaging.
It's not realistic at all, Dr. Cook. And, when I'm hearing you talk about that, when I was younger, and I would say most Black men in my age group, they just take it for granted that when you go to work, you might be at a company that is mostly white. You act a certain way or you talk a certain way. Some of them would put on their white voice. I always have a white voice because that's how I was raised. But, the white voice, the term's called code switching. And then when you get back home and back to your neighborhood, you go back to what you're normally used to. And that was just normal. And people didn't really complain about it. We just made jokes about it. Just like if maybe if you're a Latino coming up in a Latino family, you might speak Spanish at home. But then when you get to work, you're speaking English, unless you happen to work in a company that's in a predominantly Latino area, kind of like you were alluding to. Yeah. Nowadays, I can't explain this. It's like they've got us so hypersensitive that notion is now offensive to them, and that they shouldn't have to change up the way they speak or the way they handle things. The world should have to change up the way it works to accommodate what we've got going on. That it's like it's not realistic. It's just not. There's no way that's going to happen. Let's say tomorrow, Black people made up 70% of the country, and then the verbal overlap became normal, and then everybody else who's in that 30% had to adjust to that, and then they tell us, no, we got to adjust to that 30%. It's not rational, Dr. Yeah. This is stuff that is, and I know you're in academia, so I'm going to be careful, but this is the type of ridiculous crap that gets cooked up in academia. This is not what regular people think about it, from what I've seen.
I love all that. That was brilliantly stated. You're exactly right. So then I was on the airplane today, and there were people speaking Spanish, and that's fine, absolutely. But yeah, for the educational system, they have to kowtow to each and every another 76 genders. Good Lord. You can't teach truth and be expected to also pay attention to all of this. Yeah. To not be offensive is absolutely, to not be purposefully offensive. I think we're easily offended, and we don't need to be in our culture. I might offend someone and not even know I was offending them because I don't know their culture enough to understand it. But then it's your job to teach it to me so I'm no longer offensive. I don't envy today's teachers, quite frankly, or the decision makers. But you've got a good handle on this, Jeff. I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, I feel bad for the teachers, but I also feel bad for the kids because we do have a very hypersensitive generation. And honestly, what's interesting about this is that this is supposedly designed to help people of color. It's the people of color who are going to hurt more because of this. You hear about microaggressions, like what you just described. Like, say, if a white person says something to me that is offensive to me as a Black man, the way I've been trained to handle it is, okay, that's my friend. I know they didn't mean anything by it. I can use that opportunity to kind of teach them the right way, just like people have done with me in different cultures, and then you keep it moving. That's it. But nowadays, black men and women are just taught to be so sensitive that they have to call that person out on social media. They have to cancel that person. They have to try to get that person fired. They have to almost fight the person. They have to yell and scream about it. They have to go on their blogs and cry about how hard life is as a black man in America, because sometimes white people say things that are offensive without knowing it. And white people should know exactly what everything that's going to offend us and be able to keep up with all of it. You got me on a roll here, Dr. Cook. I don't know.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Talking.
Oh.
But it's sad. This is dangerous. I see this
as
dangerous.
Yeah, that's so well communicated. You're exactly right. Why would we expect everyone to understand? And so educate me. And at the same time, you educate me, you understand that I wasn't intentionally dismissing you or your whole race or your whole cultural identity. And, that's where I think in the public schools, again, where parents and students themselves we're really, a lot of us are getting really fed up with that, because that's when you cross the line. Yeah. No, well stated, Jeff. That was really well stated. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's part of the indoctrination process. I know that most of these teachers think that they're doing something good when they're teaching this stuff. I don't think it's all insidious. Although when I put on my tinfoil hat, I'm thinking like the people at the way top, I don't know. I'm thinking that it's not an accident. But with what this stuff is going on, what do you think is the best way for parents to protect their children from it's like a cancer. It's like a societal cancer that's being indoctrinated into children. What's the best way to protect them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like that analogy. I would say, boldly, you pull them and you homeschool them. I mean, I don't say that lightly, but I do believe that people can homeschool. I know of single parents who do it. I know of people who both work, but they find a way to homeschool their children. We don't do it arrogantly, but we do it to disciple them in the family values and the things that matter, as well as the 2 + 2 = 4, absolute objective truth of education. And we also teach at home these other cultures. We make sure that we're not just bringing them home to protect them from all the evil that's out there. We want them to understand the culture and understand other people. So don't get the idea that I think you homeschool so that you isolate and you segment and it's a different type of discrimination. That's not the case at all. But you can individualize according to learning style. You can individualize according to family values. You have a music smart kid. Now she can take violin and flute because there's time to do so. You're busy, but it's a different kind of busy. If we home educate, we still pray for the system, because 90% of the kids in America are still there, approximately. Don't quote me on that. But you pray for the system. You offer support if you can. You maybe offer to help people who are not homeschooling their children to see the truth of the lie, so that you can begin to disciple your neighbors and your colleagues and maybe your family members who don't see it for what you and I and other people see it to be. I think if you stay in the system, you do it with your eyes wide open, and you make sure that your children know deep down that they can ask you anything and tell you everything. They need to be able to come off the bus and you pick them up at school or whatever and say, Dad, this is what the teacher said today. Your kids have got to be willing to tell you the truth. And then you don't, become an alarmist with a, loaded gun in the back seat. But you provide protection to your mind, to your child's mind, heart, soul, and spirit, and support. Elizabeth, how can you handle it tomorrow if your teacher does something similar? So if you got them in the system, you've got to support them. And there are some better systems out there than others. Some great friends of mine are making it work because they've invested in their children. If you don't homeschool them, you must make sure that you're still very invested in what are they learning, how are they doing, and what are they hearing. I know of many mixed race couples where there's a black man married to a white woman married to a black man, and they've had to pull their kids because the children were actually learning that their mom's race was evil. And so
wow.
That's critical race theory, right? And so the teacher might not have realized that the child was from a biracial family, but I'm bringing that up in the light that you pull your children for different reasons and motivations, but certainly you are a family ordained by God. You are a perfectly imperfect parent for your children. They're perfectly imperfect children. And you are an ordained family by God's design. He ordains the family before he ordains the church. And you are responsible. You just are responsible. And so own it and make sure you know what you're doing. And if you're curious about a different option of schooling, find people who can answer your questions and do your research and find out.
Yeah, so I want to talk more about homeschooling. and I asked that question because I knew what your answer was going to be. But I want I mean, 'cause my girlfriend and I talk about this all the time. She actually has her own show too, where she talks a lot about this stuff. And she started homeschooling her kids, and it's interesting because she talks about how a lot of mothers don't think that they can do it, and fathers too. I know over the pandemic, homeschooling rates did go up. I mean, I think because of what you talked about earlier. So I think a lot of them saw, well, maybe I can do this. But I think there are still a lot who think that they can't. So what would you, if I was like a mother that was worried about this stuff, and you're saying you should homeschool, like, well, I don't know if I can. Like, what are the biggest things that people are afraid of, and how do you answer that?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Jeff. No one will love your children more than you. So yes, you can do it. No one knows your children better than you. So yes, you can do it. No one has a greater dream and vision for their future than you. So yes, you can do it. The high expectations that you have matter greatly. You don't have to know everything to teach it to children. You can learn along with them. Do you remember the really bad game show, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? And they had they had fifth graders competing with adults like you and me. Well, let me tell you something, Jeff. I did not need to know the capital of the state because I wasn't taking a test on Tuesday. I was capable of knowing it, but I didn't need to know it. So they made adults to look stupid. No, adults don't need to know how long the Mississippi River is because there's not a test on Thursday. If I'm a fifth grader studying that unit in history and there's a test, I'm going to know it, but I'm going to quickly forget it. So understand that you can homeschool your kids and learn right along with them when you're doing history and science and grammar and spelling and computer art and all of it. And then when your kids are older, there are co-ops where you can join a cooperative group of other families and somebody else can teach chemistry and somebody else can teach economics. Or there are hybrid schools that do 2 or 3 days in a school and 2 or 3 days at home. And so you can homeschool all the way through high school. Many people have done it well. In fact, colleges prefer homeschooled students because of their character and their maturity and their wisdom.
I didn't know that. Really?
Oh yeah, they do better. Homeschooled, I'm not making this up. Homeschooled children do very, very well in just about any university. They do very well on the entrance exams and on the interviews, partly because they also have more service projects on their resume, if you will. They've learned to be, concerned with others, and that's something universities are looking for today more than others. So we can manage our time, and you can homeschool in 4 hours a day. You don't have to do 7 or 8 hours a day because you don't have 20 students. You only have 1 to 6 students, maybe 1 to 9 or whatever. And so, don't be thinking 8:30 to 3, I got to buy desks and a whiteboard. Some people do that, but you don't have to do that. There's all kinds of different methods for homeschooling, and you find out from others what works. Reading and math, right? Just read a lot and do a little bit of math, and then add a little bit of science, a little bit of history, and you'll keep adding and it'll be fine. And I mean that with everything in me. There's good research out there to support what I'm saying and good people that, people can talk to in their local communities.
So would you say that that's probably the main reason why more parents don't homeschool? Like they just don't think they can, or do you think there are other objections?
Many people tell us that they don't think they're smart enough. They didn't like school, so they're afraid they're going to pass on negativity. They didn't do well in school. They don't understand high school. So it's because they have a school model in their head. They have the bell rings and we do 20 minutes of this and 40 minutes of that. That's not how homeschoolers have to homeschool. So that's the main reason. I don't think I'm smart enough. I didn't like school enough. I've had a lot of parents say, I don't think I like my kids enough to be with them 24/7, 365.
Okay, maybe I can understand that.
Yeah, I've got a dominant Donnie and a chatty Kathy, and I'm gonna kill them by noon. But in reality, you get to delight in the strengths of your children when you homeschool, and you go to the park every day, and you go to the library and the museum and the botanical garden, and you can go to the grocery store, and that's a school lesson on budget and finance, and so. There's just so many things that make it delightful, even if you feel like your kids are a handful. It's very doable. There are parents who love to work. There are parents who are called to, effective jobs and ministries, and they don't want to give that up. And I respect that. Again, there are ways that you can make it work. I will say that one of the best reasons to homeschool is sibling relationships. Your siblings will know each other. Boys and girls, young and old, will cooperate. They will learn together because you can teach history to everybody together and science to everybody together. Reading and math, you have to separate kind of by age development. They'll have better social skills for multi-generations than anybody else. Because you know what, Jeff? In school, you're with 28 7-year-olds all day. Nowhere else in your life are you going to be with 28 kids the same age as you.
Right.
Nowhere.
Right.
In
That's
church,
true.
in life, in corporate America, in the service industry, you have to work with people who are very different from you. So when you homeschool, you serve every other Tuesday at the homeless shelter and every other Friday at the nursing home, and you go to co-op and you get involved in church, and so your children develop relational skills with adults, with teenagers, and with their peer group, and that's a real positive reason to homeschool.
So what about, and I'm sure you've never heard anybody bring this up, but what about when they talk about socialization? Oh, if you homeschool your kids, they won't be socialized. I'm sure you've never heard anybody bring that up to you. Right?
No. Well, that's why I just said what I said, really, that, socialization in a public school is, 20 minutes of recess and, 25 minutes of lunch, and you're with kids who are your age, but they might not have much in common with you other than that. It's a forced friendship, if you will. When you homeschool, you have a socialization of all races, potentially culture, both genders, certainly younger and older, because most homeschool families get out of the house, go to the library, go to the museum, go to the park, go to the toy store. They tend to serve. So we tend, as homeschoolers, to have great relationships with people across the board. And socialization in the family is better. There's a new respect for mom and dad, a new respect for the older and the younger child, whether they have special needs or not. And that's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing. And again, research would uphold that homeschooled children have higher character, a more mature character, and therefore a healthier socialization.
Wow. Yeah. And see, and one thing I didn't know, and I didn't know that when people homeschool, like they go out and do things, although I didn't know that they did it to the extent that you're saying. I mean, when you think about that, I mean, probably if I didn't know it, other people don't know it either. And they're thinking, oh, homeschooling is just, we're just at home for 8 hours a day and I'm just teaching them these subjects. Like, I just learned that that's not true. I mean, it's a fewer hours and you're doing stuff outside of the home.
Right. Some families will delight in staying home, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what's interesting is most people did not understand that the pandemic and the quarantine was very hard for homeschoolers. It was very hard for homeschoolers because they used to go to the library every week, and they would go to the park and they would study biology in the park, and they would go to the American History Museum in downtown, whatever, as their history lesson, and they would read to an aging neighbor, and they would serve at the homeless shelter. These are real things that I'm saying. And so, and the 4 hour a day is very common. Some people homeschool longer because they start later and they do devotions that last a long time, and they have a rhythm. They have piano lessons in the middle of the day. Like, you can go to the store in the middle of the day when it's not crowded, and then you extend your homeschooling until 4 o'clock. You can do that. But if once you develop a rhythm of homeschooling and your kids are old enough to independently read, independently do their science, independently write their economics paper, you're with the little one teaching them how to read while your 17-year-old is over there doing a dual level class, earning college credit while she's still graduating from high school, and it's a good thing. So there's a lot of advantages. I appreciate being able to talk with you about it. The data is in that more and more people are homeschooling than ever before, and we're excited about that because it can be good for family. It's good for faith. If you're a person of faith, no matter what your faith is, and you want to pass on your values, when you homeschool, there are fewer other voices that your kids will be forced to hear from. You'll have a bit more control over that, and you'll be able to pass on the family values, and the chances are better that your grandkids will become like your kids because you've homeschooled. There's not a guarantee, but there's a better likelihood.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are no guarantees. But what about when it comes to, say, like private schools? Let's bring that up. I mean, because the school choice movement is very popular right now, and people want to get out of public schools. And you're right, homeschooling rates have gone up. So have private schools and even charter schools. Public school attendance down. I've looked at the numbers too. So what would you say to somebody who's considering maybe just finding a private school that isn't teaching all of the woke stuff?
They're there. We do need to be careful, though, because private schools, to get numbers of enrollment, some of them have compromised and are trying to look like the public school to win the public school people into their enrollment. They want the money, if you will, which is really tragic. This is not true. There are some excellent private schools who have stayed firm on their cultural values. Others have not. So again, I would look at curriculum. What publisher have you chosen for history? What publisher have you chosen for science? Do you teach evolution or creation here? Those are questions that we have a right to ask. What's your phone policy? Would be another one I would ask in any school nowadays, because that's a huge dilemma. I would look at maybe even where did your teachers graduate from college? If it's a Christian school and none of the teachers graduated from Christian colleges, I would be concerned.
Oh, wow. I didn't think about that.
Now, there's no guarantee in a Christian college, but in a Christian college where my nieces and nephew and others I know have attended, you go to chapel, you have Bible as a minor, so you read the Bible more. You've heard great presentations through the years, and so you're going to have a more biblical mindset toward even history and science and literature. If you're a Christian school but everybody's graduated from Princeton, I would run in the other direction.
I can't imagine why. But I agree. I mean, and I just brought that up because, some people just maybe they have to work and maybe they can't homeschool, but private schools are an option. I do think that homeschooling is probably the ideal. Because you're right. Nobody's going to love your kids the way you are. Nobody's going to understand their kids like they will. All of that. That's all true. So last question I want to ask you. You've seen how this has gone over the past couple of years, the critical race theory, the culturally responsive teaching, gender identity. I mean, we've got all kinds of horrible material we're discovering in libraries and in introducing classrooms and things like that. I mean, I'm sure you've seen all the drag queen show stuff. I mean, they're really going after the kids. How do you see this overall debate shaking out over the next 3 to 5 years? If you had to take out your crystal ball and predict.
That's a great question. I'm paying attention to school board elections nationwide. Are there parents from the public school system concerned enough to put up with a hell on earth experience to run for school board, to stand up for a different curriculum choice, to stand up for a different discipline policy, to stand up for a different bathroom policy? If we do not see conservative people who put principles before politics, if we don't see them stand up, I love that phrase. If we don't see people in the system who are doing it right, able to stay in the system, and Jeff, they're tired and they're lonely because they're not being supported. No one's thanking them anymore. But if we don't see, the right people standing up and getting promoted, and by right people, I'll be bold to say conservative evangelicals who don't want the culture to change. So I'm watching that. School board elections. State Department of Public Instruction is another one to keep an eye on. I would like to see the Department of Education in the cabinet disband. That's a mistake Reagan meant, because education is a state issue. In the Constitution, education is a state issue. One of the biggest problems that started, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, started from a national perspective. And it's ridiculous to think that an inner city child in Houston and an inner city child in New York City and a rural kid in Lafayette, Indiana should be learning the same thing on the same day. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the federal government needs to get out. The states need to get it right. And the people who want change need to stop whining and complaining about it and do something about it. And I don't say that lightly. I'm proud of anybody that's listening who's willing to say, I wonder if she's talking to me.
Yeah. And especially when it comes to school board. I mean, I have a friend, Kira Davis at Red State. She's running for school board. And, I've talked to some other people who are running it. It's not easy.
No.
But we need people in different facets of education. So we got to do this again, Dr. Koch. I hope I can have you back on, because there's just so much here. I mean, then there's just so much to talk about, and we do need to be having these conversations. But before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Well, thank you. And Jeff, I would come back. You're a thoughtful gentleman. who you were prepared and didn't waste my time. And I value that you wanted your people to understand some of these ideas. So thank you. Our website is celebratekids.com. And so they can find out more about who we are and what we do at celebratekids.com. We have a shopping cart like any other ministry with our books and resources there. You can certainly Google me or go to an Amazon type site. My last name is spelled Koch, even though it's pronounced Cook. So people could look at a place like Amazon and find out about my books as well. We have a podcast as well called Celebrate Kids with Dr. Kathy. So I'd love them to come over there and learn. I mean, and we've just did a huge series about character. And I just started a new series about resiliency, which is the new book that is coming out of mine in about 2 weeks. So I'd love them to hang out with us there as well.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks for coming back on, and I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. Appreciate it.